Welcome, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Jenni.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, as Jeremy did. When I was first asked to speak, this was the topic that was suggested to me, and later the topic of the session changed. But I saw this come up in an SMH article very recently, this exact question, and I thought there are so many things that we need to consider when we talk about sustainable food production, and I think Jeremy gave a really great summary of how complex and incredibly difficult it can be to consider all of the different aspects. But this is a question that comes up a lot for me personally. I'm a mostly vegetarian and I work in an organisation that's probably 60% vegetarian or vegan. And I think it's a good place to start because it comes up so frequently. So to look at this question and consider this question almost gives us a basis for then going into all of the other areas that we need to consider when we talk about sustainable food production. So I'm not sure if anybody came across this particular SMH article, but where I saw it was SMH reporting on the new World Health Organization report on the cancer impacts of processed food. So their headline was, "Now that the WHO says processed meat causes cancer, should we all go vegetarian?" And I guess for me, to read it is just to think, what? How do you get from processed meat cancer to vegetarian? But it's a link, it's a leap. It's a leap that people make a lot. So that's why I want to sort of half answer it, or begin to answer it today. So I work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. We're a research centre here at UTS. We do applied contract research for clients. We look at, help them look at situations that they're facing, come up with potential policy response options, and then help them implement, monitor and evaluate those options. So, to start off with, I think we should break this question down, and it's really interesting to me to see it in this format. Should we all go vegetarian? The first question that arises when I hear that is, who is all? Who do we mean by all? Do we mean by all the people in this room, all the people, say, in the Greens movement, all the people in Sydney, all the people in Australia, all the people in the world? Who do we mean by all? Oh, and I should pause and just say, I'm going to answer this question from an environmental point of view. I know that there's a number of reasons that you might ask this question if you're considering ethics and animal rights, if you're considering health, like the obviously the new research on health. And I think those different perspectives are super important, but my background is from an environmental point of view, which is why I'm targeting on that, not to say that the other perspectives aren't also important when you're answering this question for yourselves and for the movement. So, yes, when we talk about should we all go vegetarian, why is it, though, that we ask this question? Why does it come up? And I think it's basically because some of the environmental impacts of meat production, are pretty hard to ignore. So, globally, agriculture and food production, from production all the way to manufacturing, storage, consumption and waste, is estimated to be about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. In Australia, the Federal Department estimates that 10% of Australia's emissions are from livestock. So that's a pretty big proportion. As we were talking about, we heard Jeremy talk about land clearing and 70% of agricultural land in Australia, also across the planet. So this is a huge impact on our land. Think about soil erosion, land clearing, runoff into waterways. There's a huge issue about so much of our land being, focused on livestock production. Water as well. We heard reference to the Murray-Darling in terms of organic capsicums, but particularly around livestock. So even at the conservative end of estimates, 15,000 litres of water to produce 1 kilogram of meat. So that includes the entire production of meat, from growing the grains that get fed to meat, if they're grain-fed livestock. Huge, huge issues, particularly in countries like Australia where we have big water issues. And other things that come up, pesticide use, as we said, erosion, runoff from manure, cow manure into waterways, and diversion of food that needs to go to feed the animals that could otherwise actually be going to human consumption. So production of meat is a big environmental impact. Scarily, the FAO estimates that meat production and consumption will actually double between now and 2050. So if we thought we had problems now, just imagine if meat production and consumption doubles. So going back to my question about who is all, when we say all, who do we mean? That figure from FAO saying that meat production is likely to double comes mostly on estimates of increases of meat consumption in developing countries. So this is a projection. You can see the different regions of Australia and of the world and how much they're likely to grow between now, 2006, which is a few years ago, and 2050. And you can see some pretty steep increases there in different regions of the world. And this is not surprising because one of the things that we know is that meat consumption increases as income increases. And so as the more developing countries around the world actually continue to develop and their incomes raise, so does the meat consumption. This is particularly evident in China, the growing middle class of China, and their huge increase in meat consumption over the last 10 years. But does that mean that all of these countries, are we talking about these countries when we say we all need to go vegetarian? Because if you consider the case now...
Oh, just that previous graph, what are those blue dots up in the top right-hand corner?
The plotted graph. They're just certain countries that are particularly high. They're probably going to be the US, Australia,
Brazil,
certain countries in industrialised world. I don't have the exact.
So the red line is the statistical line that should follow?
Yeah, it's the trend.
Okay.
So if we look at consumption now, though, despite these projected increases, it's still clear that for the most of the world, meat consumption is not, high levels of meat consumption is not normal. It is in the industrialised countries like Australia, America, in Europe, and as we see more and more in South America, where high meat consumption is an issue. So when we talk about all, who are we talking about? Certainly from my point of view, meat is a very efficient delivery of nutrients. When you compare it to the per gram or per calorie amount of nutrients that you get in meat compared to plant-based foods, it really is an efficient delivery of nutrients. And when you consider the proportion of the world who are food insecure, who have trouble getting enough nutrition already, who are starving, malnourished and things like that, to assume that we might say we all need to go vegetarian, to me that doesn't sit right. So I tend to think more in terms of things like contraction and conversion. So this is something that I first came across in terms of actual emissions generally, but I think it has really good applicability to other issues. So this is kind of just a hand-drawn graph. If we imagine that the idea was that we were all going to become vegetarian, the vertical line we might assume is now. We would still see, from my point of view, that there is a need for people in developing countries to actually be able to continue to increase their meat consumption so that they're actually allowed to meet their nutrition needs, but that potentially we might see that that could level off once they've reached certain levels of development, once their populations are food secure. But for people in industrialised countries, that is not the case. So contraction and convergence generally was along the idea that there is a sustainable level of use that you might say per person in the world, and people who are above that need to come down, that's the contraction, and people who are below it need to come up to the convergence. Where that line is set, whether that's zero or perhaps a bit higher, is something to answer. But so from my point of view, if we were to say, should we all go vegetarian, and we mean globally, the answer is no.
Sorry, what was the IC?
Oh, sorry. So industrialised countries, advanced developing countries, and least developed countries. So advanced developing countries would be China and India, some of the South American countries. So if we assume just for the moment that we're talking about people in industrialised countries, and we're saying, should all people in industrialised countries be going vegetarian? That's perhaps a better place to start this conversation. But why, if we're talking about food consumption, are we talking about vegetarian? Why are we talking about meat when we already saw, as Jeremy pointed out, the huge impacts of agriculture as a whole? Not just meat, but all our plant-based, all our crops. So why meat? If we consider it from a carbon emissions point of view, I think, again, it becomes pretty obvious. So these are the carbon emissions per kilogram of food, the numbers along the top and the bottom, and then in the middle is kind of equivalent how far a car would drive. Meat, totally up the red end. But now, interestingly, look at cheese. There's cheese right up there with all the meat. So when people say, should we all go vegetarian, and they're not saying, should we all go vegan, already there's an issue there. So livestock, dairy particularly, has very high environmental impacts that are similar to meat. So if you're talking about this and you're serious, if you're just asking why vegetarian, you're ignoring a huge part of the impact of livestock on the environment. That's it. So if we look at that then in terms of diet, there's some interesting research that converts that to say, how much do people of different diets eat and what are the emissions impacts of those diets? So you can see meat lover, average meat consumption, no red meat, no beef, vegetarian and vegan. And you can see, obviously, that the emissions are decreasing as you step through those different diets. What's really interesting for me is just the difference between meat lover, average and no beef are actually the biggest reductions. Just moving through the 3 columns on the left, before we even get to vegetarian and vegan, see really high, really substantial decreases in our carbon emissions. So if we're talking about going vegetarian or we're talking about our meat consumption, vegetarian is a pretty all or nothing. Most people consider vegetarian to be no meat. No meat. Vegan is no animal products. When I try and say, I'm a 95% vegetarian because I eat meat once a fortnight, people are like, oh, I don't understand, are you vegetarian or you're not? I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of approaching this discussion. For people who choose vegetarian, say for ethical reasons, I think there's a different response to it. But if your concern is the impact on the environment or potentially the impact on your health, I don't think an all or nothing approach is a helpful way of considering this question. But if we were talking about, for example, halving meat and dairy consumption, these are some of the impacts for Europe. So 42% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, 40% reduction in nitrogen pollution, 25% reduction in land use. They're pretty significant from halving. Even in Australia, some data from the ACF came up and said if every Australian reduced red meat by a single serve, 1 serve a week, that would be the same of taking an eighth of Australia's cars off the road. 1 serve. Just 1 serve of meat. Doesn't even say that, says nothing about chicken, fish, poultry. Just 1 serve of red meat has a significant impact. So if we're talking about vegetarian and we're talking about it in an all or nothing kind of way, again, I don't think that's a helpful way of approaching that. When we talk about meat, again, this is a really interesting thing. This is from the US that looks at the proportion of emissions from diet. One of the things that really jumps out to me is the 25% of drinks, oil and snacks, our highly processed food. I remember being on an interview with the ABC where I was talking about a meat-free day campaign, and I had a lady from the CSIRO who was arguing that we didn't need to give up meat, we just needed to give up sweets. She said, eat as much meat as you like. You might know that the CSIRO promotes a high meat consumption diet, but their point of view was not a meat-free day, but a sweet-free day. And actually, if you look at it, red meat compared to all of our processed foods, actually you could potentially get a similar outcome. So again, something to consider when you're thinking about what choices do we need to make. And again, oh, that's my alarm, how embarrassing. And that's going to keep going off. So, apologies. No, it gets louder. Sorry about that. And then to place it in context of meat, of some of the other impacts that meat has, that food has. We can consider food miles, we can consider the processing, the embodied energy that food has, considering the packaging and food waste, And overconsumption. This is a really interesting thing, I think, particularly in industrialised countries. When you talk about food waste, that's an area I'm particularly passionate about and working. Overconsumption is one of the biggest forms of food waste. Every time you eat anything more than what you need, in one sense, you've wasted all of the resources that go into producing that food. Of course, you get other things from eating. You get pleasure, so you're getting other things from eating that. But from a very technical point of view, anytime you're eating more than what your body actually needs, your body's wasting it. It's going out as waste. That's the waste of everything that's gone into it. So, I guess coming back to this question, I am a 95% vegetarian. I eat meat on average about once a fortnight, but to most people I say I'm vegetarian because it's a bit complicated. But I don't think the answer is for everyone to go vegetarian. Certainly not globally, certainly not right now globally, and definitely not everyone all at once. If you imagine that actually somehow we managed to convince everybody in Australia that we should all go vegetarian right now, imagine what would happen to our food supply system. Things like this need to be transitions, they need to be considered carefully. I think the latest research on Australian food security says that we only have about 3 weeks of food supply in Australia if our food systems were to break down. So if you imagine that we just stopped eating meat right now, all of us, at once, we obviously have to replace that with plant-based foods. There's not enough food in Australia, let alone the impact that will have on our farmers, the economic and the social and the personal impact that will have on farmers who are producing that. So questions like this that are very all or nothing, I don't think they're a helpful way of approaching this debate. For me personally, this is something I like to follow when I think about how do I make my food choices. Very heavily plant-based, vegetables at the bottom, fruits, legumes moving up. Right at the top is meat, but interestingly, there are all our processed foods as well. So picking up that conversation. But the one that I like the most, I came across it and I keep coming back to it and coming back to it and coming back to it, is micropollen. Very simple, but at the same time, very, very comprehensive. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And by food, Michael explains it as food that your grandparents might have eaten. That means local food, food that was produced around them or by them, and food that was not packaged, whole food. So to me, I think this is the best message that I could give if people were saying, what should we do about our food? How should we make food choices? There is a lot more. It's very complex, but coming back to a simple message, this would be mine.